Okay, hi everyone. I'm here finally for my June and May wrap-ups. I'm doing it in 1 month, even though it's going to be kind of annoying to edit and film, just because I'm so behind and I don't want to do two individual videos at this point. So let's go ahead and do it. I mean, thankfully well, not thankfully, but I just happened to have been busy, so I haven't read as much as I would have liked to, I think. But still, a decent amount across the 2 months. These 2 months were both dedicated to two different themes. There was the Asian Readathon in May, which was the primary focus of my reading during that time, and then there was the Queerlit Readathon, and also just the fact that it was Pride Month in June, which led to me reading almost exclusively queer books. I'm going to focus on first May and then June, and then maybe I'll give you some timestamps if I'm in the mood. So let's start with some arcs, just because I have my computer in front of me already. Let's start with Zachary Ying and the Dragon Emperor. I read this one because of the wonderful things he does. Because it was the non-binary book club book, and also I got an arc granted on NetGalley. I was really excited for this. I will say that I was probably more disappointed than anything, but not a bad book. 3.5 to 4 stars is my rating. I think part of it is I don't read a lot of middle grade, so that writing of it was new for me, hard for me to adjust to. I did a whole review of this. It was really deep in the themes and ideas it was exploring. The idea of good and evil, and what is good and what is bad, and or the way we judge people from the outside. And the idea, like the setup, is really fascinating. It's like, for me, I read this fresh off of reading the Poppy War trilogy, and this uses a lot of, I think, similar themes from Chinese mythology. It was really interesting to see them executed in similar different means. It also explored Chinese history in a way that was new to me, really fascinating. Intersect that with the themes of, good and bad, and what is good and what is bad. And it was a really fascinating book. I think some of the plot points, I don't know, it just didn't work for me as well as I would have liked it to. That, coupled with the writing not quite being my style. For more information, check out the full review of that. Next up is one I don't have a review for, just because I find it hard to do standalone reviews for collections. I've considered doing shorts, I just haven't gotten into it yet. I don't know, but I'm rambling. Someone in Time, which is an anthology of love stories that are time travel related. Time travel stories that revolve around love. Some of them were really good, some of them so-so. I think I gave this a solid 4 stars. What was that? What it was? Yeah, about 4 out of 5 stars. There were some good ones, there were some bad ones. I know Shauna McGuire was in this, which I was excited for, and I was a little disappointed in her story. Like, her story was fantastic, but the love story side of it was, if it felt like she had a time travel story that she'd written, and it was like, okay, let me make it a love story by tapping on this quick amendum at the end of the story. I was like, okay, then it's not a love story. I wasn't looking for romance. Like, I went into this knowing it was a love story collection, but I just, like, with little things like that, with some of the stories, at least that one in particular, didn't mesh with me because of the fact that it just didn't feel like it was created as a love story. And I don't know. Overall, like, they worked well for me, and I think it was more good than bad in my memory. So 4 to 5 star. Next up, A History of Scars by Laura Lee. This is a nonfiction work, memoir, about Laura Lee, her writing career, and her history with her parents, and I think her abusive father, and her own mental health issues. And I really enjoyed this book, as much as one can enjoy this kind of a dark story. And I was able to connect to it, but like on a number of ways, both as a way of mirroring myself in some ways, but also as a window, because of course she has very different experiences for myself in some ways, and others ways I can relate. I really appreciate the powerful narrative that was going on here. It definitely resonated with me in a strong way. I think I gave this between, 4 stars, but I might say between 4 to 4.5. So overall, a solid collection. I need to write a review for that, post it on NetGalley. I have a problem of reading books, reviewing them even on YouTube sometimes, and just not posting the dedicated written review because that just takes so much work. And finally, we're going to talk about You Are Eating an Orange, You Are Naked. This is a story that I was excited for when I first heard about it a couple of years ago when it was being nominated for the Canada Reads Award. And I also thought it was queer at first for some reason, but it's not. It's a story, what the fuck is it? It's weird. It's weird in, like, the writing style is, I think, abstract. Now it's telling the story. It feels like the second person, like the author is reading to us as if we're his partner. And like, I did this to you, we did this, I did this. That writing was interesting from a literary standpoint, but from a reading standpoint, it wasn't the most compelling, even if it was intriguing. It also felt less like an actual narrative, so much as a compendium of stories within a story. Like it was a way in which to communicate a short story collection of like other types of parables or something, more so than the actual narrative of him and his girlfriend. So putting aside that for now, let's focus on the physical books I have. Okay, how to do this. Let's start with a couple that I talked about. I made you a freakout tag. I'm going to direct you there for in-depth thought processes. There is Ted Chiang, which I said was my favorite of the year so far. A sci-fi collection, a little bit of fantasy, with discussions at the end of each story about what motivated him to create the story. And I loved how rooted it was in philosophy and science, and how creative it was. It was so amazing. Again, more for that in my major freakout tag. The Devours, a werewolf story similar to Interview with the Vampire. We have a werewolf telling his story to a professor who is then recounting the tale to us in sort of a notebook or something. This is more than that kind of story because it's very queer between the narrator and the person who's collecting the story. Like, I feel like there's not much of a story between the vampire and the journalist taking his story and Interview with the Vampire, but in this, their story is as much a part of the narrative as the werewolf's history story, like this his story of his life and the lives that preceded him, or as much a part of the narrative as their story together. And there's a lot of queer aspects and relationships around gender. It's very sexual and very dark, very explicit, and also some trigger warnings to be aware of going into this that I would advise looking into if you're concerned about that kind of thing in any area. Honestly, one of my favorites of the year. It's really, really good. I'm going to call it 5 stars. I don't care what I wrote it down as. A disappointment in a lot of ways, I think, next would be Exit West. And this is an immigration story of trying to escape, I want to say Afghanistan. I don't remember. It's been a while since I read it. There's a bit of a portal fantasy going on here. At least that was my impression going in. But I'll be frank, I was very confused what was going on. And I think that really hindered my ability to read this. Also, I was traveling not in the best headspace when I tried to read this. I think it all contributed to it being not the best experience. Probably 3 to 3.5 stars. I hate saying that, but it was a tough one for me to get through. Even if the narrative itself was powerful, it's just one of those things that was too confusing to really appreciate, at least in the first read through. Next up, let's move on to June now. Oh, that's not true. For the Octavia Butler slow read, I thought this was going to be in May, but it turns out the reading was actually been postponed until the end of July. So it's worked out because I ended up missing it anyways. This is a reread of Parable of the Talents, the book 2 in the duology of Earth, the Earthsea duology. Basically, we're continuing the story of Lowen Olamina. There's a middle name there, I'm forgetting. But she's basically the creator of this Earthseed religion. God has changed. Everything you touch, you change. Everything you change changes you. And honestly, the more I read these, because I've been rereading them a lot lately, when I say a lot, I read the first book now 3 times. This is my second time reading this one. And that religion, quote unquote, really resonates with me. We think about how to progress life, especially in this time where things are really dark. In this book, there's hope. In some ways, our lives seem hopeless, and we have to remember God has changed. God is malleable. He can be shaped, but God can also shape us. God will come regardless. So change will come whether we want it or not. And the question is whether or not we're going to be passive recipients, victims of that change, or we're going to be manipulators, shapers of that change, the instigators of change. And that is what will define our future, whether or not we take an active part in making it happen. Because complacency is not the solution. It is the reason this is happening in the first place. Okay, moving on to my arcs in June. Let's go with You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. I did a vlog with this one, among others. So I recommend you check out that. This was a solid story. It was a messy love story. My biggest issue is that I didn't quite believe the conclusion. But personally, I like this. I like how it forces us to reckon with the humanity behind people on all sides of a complicated situation, while reckoning that there are problems with all sides of it, dealing with that. Even if you don't agree with what was going on in the story, I think the ability to humanize was the most powerful part of the story. And of course, Joaquin Mezzi is a phenomenal writer. To Be a Trans Man, a story of trans experiences as being trans man, what it means to be a trans masculine, basically, to be masculine at all, whether you be a trans man or not. And this was a fascinating set of stories that were interesting perspectives. I think the biggest flaw here is that they're basically interviews put in text. And that doesn't make a very good book, be frank with you there. I think you give it 4 stars because it was a very powerful collection. But I think more work could have been put in to make this an actual narrative instead of just a list of interview back and forth conversation, to be frankly, completely honest. 3 Names of Night. I ended up finishing this even though I said I was DNFing it. I did not reread anything. I think I gave this between 3.5 and 4 stars because I was struggling so much to follow along, to connect. Part of it was just the headspace I was in. This is a fascinating story of a trans immigrant man who is reckoning with the loss of his mother, still 5 years later, living with his grandmother, who doesn't necessarily accepts everything about him, not necessarily in a bigoted way, more of just intended as a sort of not capable of understanding type of way. Maybe I'm projecting a little too much, I don't know. The narrative between them was really fascinating, and the story follows this sort of painting that he's trying to prove existed, or something that, not this painting, these birds that were painted by this painter. His mother supposedly saw or something. I'm not totally sure. I got lost somewhere in there. That's part of the issue, was that I think I didn't quite follow all the perspectives at first, and when I did figure it out, I was like, shit, how could I have been so confused? I still appreciated everything I had to say, and it was a really powerful narrative, even if I think the main plot about the painter and the bird they're trying to prove, that didn't resonate with me. I did not appreciate that, but I think it was only ever meant as a milieu by which to explore his identity and his family history, and that much I did appreciate. Now let's move on to other books that are not arcs. Let's start with a book I talked about in that vlog as well, The Future of Another Timeline. This one, wow, I have such high expectations, but it was a disappointment, to be honest with you. It's not bad, but it's not what I was expecting. I think part of it is the writing didn't quite work for me. I think it's trying to take it so seriously, but there were parts of it for some reason didn't mesh with me. It felt unreal. And I say this as someone who is fully capable of being immersed in the most fantastical of worlds. And it's not that I need it to feel real for our world. I need to believe that within the constructs of this world, everything that's going on makes sense. And it's not even that I think the type of oppression that's going on in this book isn't possible. I mean, the things that go on in this book are already happening today, and they don't need time travel to make it happen. That's not the problem. It was just something about it that didn't click with me. It just felt off. That might have to do with the writing, it might have to do with the way things were created. But as much as I appreciated the time travel, maybe that's part of it too, that the time travel itself, to bramble in different directions, I think it was over-explained. Because it was over-explained, it sort of undermined the effectiveness of the story as a whole. Contracted this with It's Like to Lose the Time War, which was a complete mess, not like in a bad way, like in a confusing way, but in a very effective way, and that didn't try to explain itself too much, because it would have undermined the point of the story. And I think this may have fallen into that hole. So 3.5 to 4 stars. Also 3.5 to 4 stars of Part Women Wanted. Another one that I would say is more a disappointment than anything. Not quite as much as the last story. It is my first story written by Sarah Gailey. And I just was expecting to like their work more. I don't know what it was about this. Maybe it wasn't the right book to start with. It's a dystopian, I think, future where oppression has begun, and basically you have librarians who pretend to be a part of the status quo but are actually spreading resistance information for the greater good, basically. And it was good. It just didn't click for some reason. But I will say the writing, I think, felt more real than the other. I will say that much. One that I absolutely adored and fell in love with. Also, the author followed me on Twitter, which was very exciting. Always exciting when the author follows me for some reason. But it makes me really question their judgments, I'm not gonna lie. 4.5 to 5 stars. We Are the Ants. This had very A.S. King vibes. It's the story of a young boy who is queer and finds out that the world is going to end, and aliens give him the option to end it. There's this underlying question of, is it real or is it in his mind? Is the world ending real, or is it his world that's ending? And that was the question I had coming into this. How could it be made real that a boy would be faced with the question to let the world end, and he wouldn't save him? How do you set that up? And very quickly in the book, and it's something I think isn't really explicitly said until later in the book, it became apparent to me that there were so many people, children and adults, who decide that they want the world to end when they commit suicide. That's basically what they're doing. They want their world and the world just to end. And that's what they do. And then to them, that is the right decision. And so once I reckoned with that, it made it much easier to be able to relate to this. It's such a powerful mental health discussion. And an interesting sci-fi side with a hint of, surrealism that you get from A.S. King. Very much in the vein of A.S. King. I was shocked at how much I loved it, or how much it just seemed like they were almost like buddy writing this together. But I really like this. Great book. Next up, another book I talk about in my Mid-Year Freakout tag, Dreadnought, superhero story about a trans teen who gets powers from basically the Superman in the story, and it explores that with the superhero themes intersecting with the themes related to transness, what it means to be trans in society. I talk about this more in my Mid-Year Freakout tag. Recommend you go to that if you want a full depth detail there. And then lastly, the last book I want to talk about here is going to be a reread that I think I mentioned at some point. Maybe it was my TBR that I mentioned it. I was not in the headspace to read for a large part of June. And that's because I know things have been really hectic with everything that's going on in my life, just as far as finishing school and finding a new job and getting ready to move. And that's part of why I haven't been feeling as much. But I didn't want to read, so I chose a book that I knew was just an easy, fun ride. And I ended up reading the entire thing. I did not start it anticipating to read it all in 1 month. I was just like, once I was in it, I was in it. And that is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. One of the many rereads. I really liked it. I will say that the more I read it, the more I begin to recognize the flaws in the system, like the problems with Stephen King and some of the things he chooses to execute or chooses to use. But I will say that while this has a lot of the quality of the old Stephen King, it doesn't have as much of the problems of the old Stephen King because it's humans in a more mature state. But it still has some problems. And as far as the actual setup of the story, as much as I love it, there are some, I think, problems with the premise of the narrative. And of course, it's overwritten. You don't need it to be as long as it is, but I love it for that. It's one of those things where you want more. Like you don't buy one serving of cake, you buy a cake because you want a fucking cake. So you eat the whole goddamn cake. That's what I do. Okay. Oh wait, no. I just realized there's one more that I haven't mentioned here. And I already packed it up, but it's James Baldwin, Another Country. I read this, and I won't lie, I almost DNF'd it a couple times because it's a lot harder to read than other books that I've read. And that is because it's heavy, it's non-linear, and it jumps between perspectives. It's basically dealing with interracial and bisexual relationships or identities, how they all come together. It is messy, and it is rough in a emotional sense. And for the longest time I was like, why the fuck are we going between characters? Who are these people? I don't understand who this is and how they connect. And then I started to get into one character. I won't say I like them, but next thing you know, like something big happens, like, okay, we're moving off from them now. I'm like, wait, I just got into them. What's happening? And then finally, it's one of those things where the story begins to piece together with time. You start to realize how it all intersects. And once I reckoned with that and started to recognize who's who in this whole group of people, it started to make more sense. And it helped that over time they began to intersect with one another. So it started to make more sense. It's a very powerful book. I see the confusion makes it not my favorite James Baldwin book, but a really good, powerful book because it's very ambitious and but it's all the better for it, I'd say. 4.5 to 5 stars. So that's the last book that I read in June and May. Thank you so much for making it to the end. If you did, I really appreciate it. Let me know how your last couple months of reading have been going, or how this one's going to be honest. And I hope you always, as always, have a safe day. Is that right? It's been too long. I don't remember how I'm supposed to end this. And as always, hope you stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.